Okay. Good evening, gentlemen. Because I say gentlemen because, as you may have remembered from our last show, turns out my audience is exclusively male. So I will just assume you guys are all men. If there are any females in the audience, I apologize for misgendering any of you. That's not my intention. Today we are joined by Dr. Jonathan Pohl. How are you doing, sir?
I'm not bad.
Excellent. And yeah, it was interesting trying to organize this because we kind of live on other ends of the earth. So you're in California right now. Is that correct?
Yeah. But
okay, yeah, and I'm in South Africa. So we got a 10-hour time zone difference, but fortunately we're able to make something work. So I guess sort of before we begin with this the stream officially, could you introduce yourself to the audience? Sort of what's your training background? What is your particular area of study? They know you're a professor of some kind, a doctor of some kind. Tell the people about you.
I have a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is part of the big umbrella of the University of London. It was founded by Jeremy Bentham back in the 19th century, but the School of Oriental and African Studies itself is not founded until 1916. I did my PhD dissertation on comparison of deported nationalities in Soviet Central Asia and Siberia, specifically ethnic Germans, Crimean Tatars, and Meskhetian Turks. And I have a couple books out before I did my PhD, including one on Soviet deportations was published in 1999. And I've got a number of smaller pieces on the subject. So I'm finishing up right now a book manuscript that a publisher in Germany is looking at a proposal for. So right now I'm at the last 35 pages to fix the footnotes. So that's one of the reasons why you didn't get any footnotes, as I was kind of sick of so I just slapdashed these notes together without any formal citation.
All right, good. Yeah, no, I remember I got my undergrad in history, and yeah, digging up those footnotes was always the biggest pain in the ass. Apart from writing the actual paper itself, the writing went pretty good, pretty easy, but sort of getting all the resources and documenting them, that was always the
right. And then to get them all in the proper format, it takes forever.
Yeah, no, it does. Okay, cool. So the topic for tonight is what you call Biostalinism, which is just kind of a fun, catchy term. I like it. I hope the people like it as well. I think they do. So first off, just a little bit of background. There's a term sort of swimming around in what you would call right-wing internet, I guess. This idea of Bioleninism.
Isn't it just internet by now?
Yeah, it might be, but I think that's kind of where it got its start. If I'm correct.
Who reads left-wing internet?
I don't know. Bots who are, probably bots. That'd be my guess. Bots and sociology students whose professors make them read it, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, so this was an idea generated by this guy called Spandrel, I believe, was sort of his idea. And as I understand it, the idea is that you have this almost sort of pseudo evolutionary process by which sort of I'm spacing on his name. Dr. Edward Dutton sort of calls the spiteful mutants. So the sort of undesirables of society sort of see Leninism, communism, and the opportunity for them, sort of a more egalitarian society, to sort of get themselves a position higher up in the hierarchy. And they become invested in the regime because it's basically the only thing sort of keeping them on top. and that's sort of what is understood as Bioleninism, very roughly, as I understand it correctly. Now, I had heard you in a stream a while ago come up with this notion of sociology students are bots. Yes, exactly. Come up with this term Biostalinism to sort of juxtapose it. So how would you describe what Biostalinism is, and how would you say it's different from what we understand as Bioleninism?
Well, I mean, the bio is almost kind of just put there because in reality, in addition to this class element of the proletariat, the disenfranchised class, and as well as kind of in a junior partnership, the peasantry in at least the Soviet model, the peasantry has a larger role in China and North Vietnam. Kind of the disenfranchised revolutionary parties. From the beginning, there was promotion and support of ethno-racial groups that were not Russians, that were not part of the ruling core of the Romanov Empire. So that existed at least from 1923 with the 12th Party Congress and the policy of korenizatsiya, which literally means to take root, but it was to encourage and support the development of each ethno-national group in the newly formed Soviet Union, the first constitution creating the USSR in December 1922, within their own little ethno-states. So you have autonomous Soviet Socialist republics and full Soviet Socialist republics, and lower on down autonomous oblasts, etc. And this would be to promote their culture in a socialist form, but also actual literal affirmative action within the local party and state apparatus to rule these regions with cadres of the people of their own ethno-racial background, so that they would reduce and hopefully, from the Soviet point of view, remove rebellion. So we see this idea, particularly promoted by Stalin, who was Georgian, that if you rule people in their own language, and that's done by people of their own ethno-racial background, they're likely to take a whole of a lot more shit than they would from somebody who was not. Or to phrase the head of the Polish political police in the 1950s, what's his name? Verfel, Roman Verfel. He said the number one rule is that if there's a beating to be done, must be done by Ivan. It can never be done by Moshe.
Okay, very, very smart. So the idea is essentially with the, as I understand, so initially you have this situation where there's a lot of degree of openness in the Soviet Union.
I wouldn't say openness. There is a xenophilic policy. So there is support for all of these non-Russian groups, these ethno minorities, and there's also, it extends to this kind of, well, I use the term deviant because that was the term in style at the time. So hopefully we won't get a strike for that, but mainly we're talking about
historical terminology.
We're talking mainly male homosexuals. The Bolsheviks in both the 1922 and 1926 criminal laws did not have any restrictions on sodomy, whereas, of course, the czars had earlier, as did the provisional government. And in 1934, male homosexuality becomes recriminalized. So we have also this as it were, removal of the tolerance from sexual minorities under Stalin.
Okay, and you said that was in 1934 where they sort of made it illegal again.
Yeah, it was a prison term. I think it might have varied, but I know in the 80s, when I was growing up, it was still a 5-year sentence in the Soviet Union.
Okay. All right, yeah. So essentially what we see is sort of this sort of empowerment of minorities. You also mentioned affirmative action as well. Is that correct?
Yes. So within their ethno territories, you got favoritism for promotion within the party, within the state, within industrial jobs, and probably most important because it was like kind of the most blatant positive discrimination, if you were, for admission to universities in those territories.
Okay, so it's sort of affirmative action in a regional sense. So in these sort of these people's homelands, we could think of them as they
Right,
are
and
sort
that
of
actually persisted all the way up to the end of the Soviet Union.
okay. So there's an explicit kind of idea of empowering sort of local nationalities to an extent where that their language is sort of preserved, and sort of the language of government, the language of education as well. Is that
Yes.
is that also the case?
Yes.
Okay.
The education, particularly for lower levels, was done in the national language as well as the Russian. So you have official education, official media supported, of course, for all of the languages that have territories connected to them, and in some cases even when they don't. So there are some diaspora nationalities that end up having their own newspapers and radio programs, even though they don't have a territory.
Okay, interesting. So it's basically the recognition, as you say, that people are much more likely to be willfully governed by people who are sort of like them. And there's a sort of an idea that, hey, let's all sort of get along, and you guys will do your thing and we'll sort of do our thing under the
Well, that
umbrella.
really
Under
it's the
the
idea
umbrella.
of reversing the empire. It's what I'm sure in Africa you've heard of Lord Lugard, right?
Uh,
He was the
I,
colonial administrator for what becomes Nigeria after
okay.
independence.
Right,
But
yeah.
what he
I'm
said
a
was
South
the best way to rule a colony was to rule it as indirectly as possible. That is, to have as
Right.
few British as possible and as many Africans as possible doing the ruling for them. So
Gotcha.
the Soviets kind of took this to turned it up to 11. So not only were the people ruling on behalf of Moscow locals, right, but they created the whole cadre, the whole elite of these locals. So they were totally dependent upon Moscow.
Okay. So like Kazakhs would sort of be in charge of the Kazakh Communist Party, and they have their cadres who are made of Kazakhs and sort of deploy them essentially, just as an example, correct?
Yeah, Kazakhstan's a good example because they probably became the most Sovietized Central Asian ethno-national group in the later Soviet period. Talking Khrushchev, Brezhnev era and beyond, but they paid a horrible price. I talk about it in my notes somewhat. The destruction of nomadism in Kazakhstan meant also the destruction of the nomads, and about 10% of the population was totally nomadic, and a quarter were semi-nomadic, and about a quarter of the population was killed in the famine from 1930 and 1933 because they were forcibly settled and they didn't have access to multiple pasture land, so they couldn't support the livestock. So they killed the livestock and ate it, and then they ran out of food, and then a large numbers of them perished.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's sort of one of the sort of overlooked things, because most people know about the Holodomor in Ukraine, but as I understand, proportionally, the Kazakhs got it a bit worse.
Yeah, because there were only 4 million Kazakhs or so, and at least 1 million died. So it's about a quarter of the population. Ukraine is about 15%. But I mean, Ukraine was very large, so
Right.
The percentage is lower primarily because it's just a huge number of people. We're talking almost 4 million people dying in Ukraine, so about 4 times what died in Kazakhstan. But Kazakhstan, as I said, you couldn't support a kind of permanent settled even past pastoralism. You needed to move around. So one of the reasons they're so big is the Kazakh communists in the negotiations in the early 20s, right? They said every plot that we use as a pasture, right, that should be our territory. So even though we don't have permanent settlements there, right, we go there sometimes, we get that land.
So it's like Lockean property rights. We mixed our labor with the land; it's ours. Our cows
Well,
ate there.
yeah, I mean, Marx basically took the labor theory of value from Adam Smith completely without changing it at all.
Mm. Now, as far as affirmative action during the sort of the Leninist period, right? Did you have that sort of at the national level as well, like in the Politburo with sort of minorities sort of being overrepresented? And
yeah, there are certain minorities that are overrepresented in the central government, but basically, for this kind of promotion, this indigenization, it's within these territories and also within certain sections. So probably the most famous is the Jewish section of the party, which is basically to try and create a Yiddish-speaking Jewish communist nationality and eliminate the kind of religious elements to Jewishness. But yeah, if you look at the very first Politburo, I think there's like one Russian in it out of 7 guys, and then Lenin is a quarter Russian, and then there's Stalin, who is Georgian. And then there's so out of the 7 guys, 4 Jews, a Georgian, 1 guy mixed race, including Lenin with a quarter Kalmuk, so he's part Asian, part Mongol. And there's also then finally the Georgian from Stalin himself in the first Politburo. Now, it's not as extreme in later, but you do all the way up until 1927 have overrepresentation of Jews in the Politburo, and then Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev are all removed, and then there's like a 3-year period with no Jewish members in the Politburo.
Right. And also, as far as the, again, historical term, sexual deviance, I believe Yazov, head of the NKVD, was also was he a homosexual as well, or is that?
Yes. Well, I mean, he engaged in homosexual affairs more than once. I mean, he was a regular practice for him. I'm not sure if we can use the identity here because he was married and also had sexual relations with women. So I mean, I don't know if we use the term homosexual as a noun here, but certainly somebody who engaged in homosexual activities, yes.
Okay, so I guess we could call the Leninist period, sort of pre-Stalin era, was a time where you would see a bit more elevation of and access to sort of minority access to central areas of power, places within the secret police, and so on. And now, sort of going on to sort of our next question. Here it is. It says from Rune Skitesing. What the hell is Biostalinism? I'm a goddamn boomer. I haven't got a clue what Biostalinism is. So I think that's
basically, again, the ethno-racial and also to include kind of the sexual reproductive element. So I haven't on my streams gone over or anything I've written on the sexual reproductive one, so I don't have a lot to say, and so I'll just cover it now. But I did link to you that BBC article on homosexuals in the Soviet Union before 1934. Particularly in Leningrad, there's a big trial of them in 33 in Leningrad. Right, but so from 22 to 34, there's no laws against it, and then it's made a criminal offense again. And then in 36, abortion is outlawed up until 1955. and it's part of a series of laws, the prohibition on abortion, which include family allowances. So I think originally it's the seventh child, they get a state payment for having each child seventh and more, and then it goes down. I think it's during the war, immediately after the fourth child and above, and so there is a encouragement for larger families. There's kind of biological support. This isn't unique to the Soviet Union. France had family allowances too, but it's a it when combined with the ban on abortion and ban on homosexuality, you can see it's kind of promoting kind of traditional gender relations, something that had become lax, particularly in the early Bolsheviks. The people like Alexei Kollontai wanted free love everywhere. And when Lenin protested, there were orgies in the streets. She said it was natural. And Lenin said, so is drinking water, but I don't want to drink from a glass that's greasy of many lips.
Interesting. Okay. So now, as far as the response from Stalinism on this, so there was this period of time, as we mentioned, with the sort of minorities, and then we have a change. There's a shift. There's sort of more what we could call sort of traditional sort of ideas of gender norms, more traditional normalized views of sexuality. But then there's also the ethnic crackdown as well. So we mentioned that Zinoviev, Kamenev, Trotsky are sort of ejected from the Politburo. And then there is, of course, large displacements and purges. So going on to sort of the next part, this sort of gets into something that a lot of people are not familiar with. And this is the, so what in the West, we're very conscious, maybe it's sort of foisted upon us, being very racially conscious, right? So, the media today is all about, there's whiteness everywhere, buy from black businesses and all this sort of stuff.
Right. Black economic empowerment.
Black economic empowerment in South Africa, so on and so forth. So we're really encouraged to think about race, but the Soviets had sort of a different notion. So one of the things that the Soviets that the left will say about the Soviets is they're like, racism is kind of an imperialist Westernist concept. That really wasn't a thing amongst the commies, but it turns out that they actually did have a fairly, you could call it scientistic, biological sort of.
Well, yes, certainly biology is a part of it. I mean, this idea of ethnos theory with Shirokagorov in exile in China, and later Bromley, but certainly even before Shirokagorov, 10 years before, Stalin's idea of what a nation is has a biological component. But you are in South Africa, and Shirokagorov and Moolman, who was Shirokagorov's biggest fan in Germany in the 20s and 30s, were the founding kind of ideological fathers of apartheid. They didn't go for an idea that it would be whites against blacks so much as there's a Zulu nation and a Xhosa nation and a Afrikaner nation, and they should all develop separately. The
English are over there.
Take root.
No, exactly. Yeah, that's true. Verwoerd, big fan. But of these guys. So I guess who these are sort of the key guys who sort of developed this idea of ethnos within the Soviet Union. So could you talk a little bit about Shirokagorov, Bromley, and sort of what were their ideas and when did they make them in this time frame? Sort of, was it Soviet? Was it pre-Soviet? So on.
Well, Shirokagorov was late Tsarist, early Soviet period, and he ends up basically getting exiled in China. He's already in China doing research, and he can't return back in the 20s. So he does some stuff early on in the 1917 to 1924 or so period, but after that he's kind of he loses. There's an official break between him and the head of the ethnographers in the Soviet Union, a guy named Lev Sternberg. And then the guy that's very close to Sternberg is a guy named Vladimir Bogarev. So they're kind of like the official head. But Shirakogorov's ideas of ethnos, the idea that groups of humanity have common history, common culture, particularly language, which is coming really from Fichte, common economy, which is something also Stalin already 10 years earlier was emphasizing, and common ancestry, in some senses, the biological component, kinship and lineage. It also, this gives them, in its togetherness, as it were, a common psychological worldview. So this idea that the groups of people were that formed this way, these various ethnoses, say Koreans or Tungus, were a group that Shirokogorov studied extensively both in Siberia and China, would think in similar ways because they had similar culture, similar history, similar genetics.
Okay. Now, as I understand it, this was kind of in contrast to earlier sociology, anthropology of the sort of Leninist era, right? So didn't they have sort of very plastic sort of idea of man, that he was a lot more malleable? And
well,
then
there's a Marxist idea of stagism, all right? So that, but this problem is, of course, that the ethnic groups didn't like dissolve. They didn't become like a Soviet man anywhere. So really, from the very beginning, basically, I would say from 1923, when they institute Korenizatsiya, because they recognize that politically what they call nationalnosti, but what becomes scholarly known in exile under Shirokogorov as ethnos, and then later in the Soviet Union when Bromley revives the idea in 1969. These groups, use the words of Bromley, have a stable ethnic core that is very long lasting. So they're not going to assimilate or go away anytime soon, although they do decline and rise. It usually is a long and slow process. And we see this, when the Soviets exile all these national groups into Siberia and Kazakhstan, that in 1948 they make the exile permanent, right? That is, navechna is the word they use in the document. So they believe that like it's going to be forever before they can politically integrate these groups, because their common history and culture and genetics makes them think in an anti-Soviet way for basically the foreseeable future in many generations.
Okay, so this is sort of where the Biostalinism sort of bites back.
Right. Well, let me just give a brief outline, because it takes a long time. Basically, the first kind of mention during collectivization, when they start rounding people up as kulaks and deporting them to the far north and Urals and Siberia and Kazakhstan, you have already a start of certain ethnic groups, particularly Germans and Poles in Ukraine, are kulaks by nature of their ethnos rather than class. So we see already the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1929 issues a decree on evicting German kulaks from Nikolaev, whereas all the other documents up until that time just say kulaks, right? They don't specify a national origin.
So what's happening here is that whereas before it was all sort of class, now sort of German, Polish becomes a proxy for being a kulak, essentially.
Yeah, but I mean, it includes very poor Germans and Poles, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so then this is done specifically. They mentioned Poles on the border in 1930 to be deported as kulaks. Uh, so this is kind of the first mentions of it, and disproportionately, you have something like 1% of the total Soviet population are deported as kulaks in 1930, 1931. But the Volga Germans, something like 6.6%, so much higher rate. And then, of course, there's the already mentioned Kazakhstan, right? They're a specific cultural trait that was essential to the ethnos, not only as defining them culturally, but also their physical survival, right? That was attacked, kind of like an attack on whiteness, maybe, right? You attack a nomadism.
Attack on nomadism.
And well, lots of nomads died. Wonder why that happened.
Yeah.
And then, of course,
moving around.
The Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor in 32 and 33, is accompanied by purges of the Ukrainian Soviet Social Republic government and Communist Party, but it mainly an assault on the social basis of Ukrainian nationalism, because Ukraine is so large. Having a second center there that is nationally conscious through the policy of Korenizatsiya that is developed earlier becomes viewed as a threat. So this is a way of kind of emasculating the basis for support for Ukrainian separatism.
Okay, so basically, the problem is, as sort of the Stalinists see it, is that you have these undigestible chunks of backward, as they would see it, sort of backward way of doing things.
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, I guess they did digest the Kazakhs and Ukrainians, but at high cost.
Right.
But yeah, some of the other groups, like the Germans and the Chechens, were kind of indigestible.
Mm-hmm. So sort of the way of dealing with them is you have to either crush them or you have to sort of forcefully sort of try to re-engineer the society. So like with the Kazakhs, with the nomadism, you got to stamp that out. And right. I remember listening in one of your earlier videos on your channel that you were talking about the Chechens and sort of how they were kind of sort of always at odds with sort of both the imperial Russian way of doing things, but also with the communist way of doing things, and now also with the Russian Federation way of doing things. So they
finally got incorporated through this kind of indirect rule. So Kadyrov gets basically to rule everything, and then he like reports to Moscow. But everything else kind of failed as a manner. So in some sense, good old British indirect rule colonialism, straight from West Africa, is the way to do it.
Have a Chechen guy you give lots of money, and then have him report to you, and then he'll just be the boss there on the ground. Okay, gotcha.
Well, that worked.
Yeah.
No, they tried everything else. I mean, Stalin literally removed every single Chechen he could find from Chechnya, dumped them out into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. 1 out of every 3 of them died by 1948, so a period of 4 years. And yet, they still managed, as soon as Stalin had left the scene, they started returning on their own, en masse, and then after they had arrived, they said, "Can we return? We're already here." And of course, at that time, Khrushchev had no real choice and say, "Okay."
Yeah, basically, it's like we got to kill all of you, or we'll just sort of like try to cut a deal here. Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's move on here. So sort of a little bit more detail. How would you say the Soviet idea of ethnos is similar to and different from sort of Western ideas of race?
All right, so that was my shortest answer on my notes, I think. Well, for one thing, neither Shirokagorov or Muhlmann, or in South Africa, Iselin, who came up with the Bantu education system in the early 1950s. So he was probably one of the most famous South African supporters of the kind of ethno theory from Shiraka Gorath and Moulaman. They believe that ethnos is constructed. They believe it's organic and that the culture is something that is not just instrumental but important. And they believe that there is a biological component, most notably endogamy, that is, not marrying outside the group in order to maintain the kind of barriers, as Barth would say, the perimeter distinguishing them from other groups intact. So most ethnoses, but particularly in Eurasia, particularly in the I guess pre-Khrushchev era, there's not a lot of exogamy. People generally do not marry outside of their group.
Okay, so that's sort of one of the defining factors in sort of preserving the ethnicity is this notion of sort of endogamy, sort of keeping, sort of marrying inside the group.
Right.
And
in fact,
okay.
Bromley's first paper at Leningrad was called, or was on ethnosis and endogamy. So.
Okay, cool. So I guess sort of moving on here, it would sort of seem to me that one of the biggest. Oh, thanks, Sugar. I was just getting back up in case the internet goes out here. Okay.
So are they cutting your electricity?
They actually
I
did
heard
today.
ESCOM was going to do some load shedding.
Yeah. So we had some the electricity cut out last night from midnight till 2:30 a.m. and then again.
That's it.
Well,
in Ghana we were on 24 blackout, 12 power, and that was at a state institution like the university and at state hospitals, for God's sake.
Yeah, no, it's no joke. And then again, we had it cut off between 4 and 6:30, so we had to go run and pick up some takeaways today instead of making dinner.
Oh, but curry?
No. Today we actually, degenerate American. We got some McDonald's, so that's what we did.
It's the only country in Africa that has McDonald's.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
I think Morocco might be the only other one now.
I believe that. I believe the Moroccans would as well, due to their proximity. But so it would seem that sort of one of the big main differences too with ethnos compared to race is that ethnos is much more specific. Race is a big, broad category. Whereas ethnos is much smaller.
Ethnos is, I mean, you have a word in Afrikaans which is the same as the German. That basically is the same, folk.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, right, obviously the Afrikaners are a folk, but white people aren't, because the English and the Lithuanian Jews and other groups that weren't assimilated into the Afrikaner culture remain separate despite racial and genetic similarities. Yeah.
So ethnos is not purely a genetic component, although genetics does play a part. It's also these sort of other things, language, culture, and so on and so forth. Things that set you apart from other groups. Sort of things that you intentionally do, which set you apart from other groups. And
I mean, intentionally might be debatable, because in most societies, these things are kind of just inherited. Right. You inherit the religion and language and way of life of your parents, and they got it from their grandparents. So this is where the endogamy is keeping it within a particular group. You know, is protecting. It's not so much that the ethnoses break down through miscegenation because of genetic intermixture, but because of the cultural intermixture, the loss of traditional culture, which can also happen without any intermarriage.
Okay, gotcha. Oh, sorry, the internet just cut out here. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I got you.
Whew. All right, good. That's one of the things here. Sometimes it's a little dodgy. Okay, so another thing that you mentioned a bit earlier. You said that in ethnos theory, the idea is that these groups sort of they sort of come about sort of organically, right? So there's this deep in the origins of time, groups come together and they sort of forge their own identity, and it's sort of an organic kind of
oftentimes, but sometimes the ethnogenesis is fairly recent.
No, of course. But that would be set aside from sort of a different idea of sort of ethnicity and race, sort of the idea that it's a sort of social construct created by elites for like
right,
dialectic materialism reasons.
The ethnos theorist, both the Shiraka and in the, I guess the White Russian politically was that's why he didn't go back to the Soviet Union. Bromley, who was the foremost ethnographer in the Soviet Union from '69 until 1990 when he died, and post-Soviet Lev Gumilev, the popularizer, but he was obviously his mother Akhmatova was very famous poet. He's like popularized this idea of ethnos theory and a lot of books in the post-Soviet period. So all of them pretty much agree, that on that ethnos is something that exists and that is real, that is organic, that is not constructed, is not instrumental, like Western anthropologists and anthropologists. But again, there's some overlap because while it's mainly an Eastern idea, the Chinese adopt this too, because Shiraka is in China. And the Chinese communists have the idea of Minzu, which is very close to Nationalnost. The Japanese adopt it. A guy named Oka writes about it. Koreans have it. But you also have it in Germany for a while in the 20s and 30s under Muhlmann, who trains a lot of South Afrikaner scholars. So you have it in South Africa during the apartheid era. But you did have it in Great Britain to some extent. When I was looking at who Shiraka was writing to, who he was discussing ideas with, two British names came up. One, and they were both very famous anthropologists at the time, but they've kind of been eliminated now. One is Sir Arthur Keefe. And
how cool.
So Keefe, you can find his books on the internet. And then, or at least one of them. And then there's a guy with George Pitt Rivers, whom they actually put in prison because he was a supporter of Mosley. So, famous anthropologist who believed that race was not constructed in Great Britain he got thrown in prison for 2 years. And so now British anthropology, those guys are basically not mentioned at all. But before World War II, they were huge names because they were up there. So the United States is less so. I mean, since Madison Grant, there really hasn't been anybody who hasn't been a Boasian.
And what is that that term you said, Boasian? Can you describe that?
Friend Boaz.
And what was his sort of key theory?
Oh, that there was no such thing as race.
Okay, so it's all a social construct essentially for elites to sort of plunder and put people against each other and so on and so forth.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. But I mean, I think that the Eastern schools of thought, not everything that came out of the Soviet Union was bad. They did have a better, I think, sense of how. It's obviously not perfect, but they did have, I think, a better sense of how people kind of organize themselves vertically in these types of cultural groups. That that culture was something more than just instrumental. That it had an importance that continued to exist for people regardless of the surrounding economic and social and political milieu. And that part of this kind of what defined different peoples is biological. In fact, I was reading an abstract from a Russian anthropologist today. He actually used the term somatic, which literally would be kind of physical phenotype. But it's one of the ways in which, if you look at a Kalmuk, right, who not a mixed, right, the Mongol or a Kyrgyz or a Kazakh, these people don't look like Russians. All right, so part of what kind of defines them as being their own distinct groups, why they are not Russians or why they are not Ukrainians, is in somewhat the kind of like racial, physical appearance. It does play a role. Although in the West, everything gets put on that level, and all the language and culture and everything else that goes along with it tends to be dismissed.
Right. Okay. So one of the things that I remember hearing about, sort of in university, and I didn't go. The history department I went to wasn't particularly leftist or anything. It was just sort of
What university did you go to?
I actually went to the one in my home state, the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't that not a good university?
No. It was. And in terms of return on investment, if you want to measure that as like a degree of success, the University of Alaska Fairbanks is the best on the West Coast after the University of Washington, Seattle, I think. So the students who go there, they tend to do pretty good. It's largely a vocational school, but yeah, I actually enjoyed the department I went to, and it was quite good. But
I had an interview for Southeast Alaska State in Juneau.
Oh yeah, the University of Alaska Southeast in Juneau. Yeah, no, that's I had a number of friends who went down there. One of them was studying fisheries and stuff. So in like the biological sciences, that
well, I was for the history department. Their history department only has like 3 people. I think they were trying to add a 4th, but it was dependent upon union negotiations with the state.
Yeah,
whether the state was going to cough up any money or not.
Right. Of course. But no, it was actually a decent university. So sort of that aside, my history aside, one of the things that I remember in this course that I took is we were discussing, and it seemed that sort of this pivot towards sort of pro-Russianism, right?
Yes.
Russification really sort of got underway in a big way around the time of the Second World War, partially as a means of trying to galvanize the people in order to sort of hold on to the territory and sort of fight for the motherland and stuff. So one of the comments here, if I can find it back here, let me see if I can find it. Okay. So it says, since Bioleninism secures power for the new regime, I'm guessing Biostalinism then maintains it. So the idea, I think what this comment is getting at is that in order to sort of gain power, one of the tricks that the insurgents will do is they'll find disaffected minorities, as we sort of talked about, and sort of try to get them as sort of junior partners onto the program. They see the incoming sort of new era as an opportunity for them, and so they can be relied upon to sort of elevate themselves. However, once sort of the regime has sort of come in, sort of taken power, consolidated, in order to actually hold on to it and have a more efficient order, it sort of pivots to sort of what we're talking about again with this nationalism element. And sort of this process of Russification could be seen potentially as an aspect of that. So what's your take on that? And what effect did the Second World War have on this?
Well, it starts before the Second World War. Really, I think it starts in 1936, where you have a new Soviet constitution, And this one kind of not only replaces the 1922 Constitution, but basically says that the 1923 12th Party Congress and Korenizacija are no longer going to be unlimited. So this is where you start to see there is no longer this kind of inside-out affirmative action empire in which every nationality is promoted except the Russians. We now see a couple articles in Pravda talking about the Russian nation for the first time since Tsarist era and how great its accomplishments are. So this is before World War II. And the other thing to remember during World War II, while there are whole nationalities, the ones that are deported, so there's at least 8, maybe 12, depending on how you count them, that are kind of people stricken from the friendship of nations, totally removed from first-class Soviet citizenship and subjected to the special settlement restrictions. For most of the Soviet nationalities, there is a promotion continuing in the Second World War of their national patriotism. So there's this idea of, the largest group obviously is the Russians fighting for Russia against the Germans, right? So this is where you have the second big boost after 36 of Russian nationalism. But you also have the idea, because that's not going to sell in Uzbekistan. So the Uzbek soldiers are told you're fighting for Uzbekistan. Right? The Kyrgyz are told you're fighting for Kyrgyzstan. Right? So you still have, on the larger level, this promotion. And this actually went all the way down to the little nations, because you see it all, even with those that are deported, they have kind of heroes, right? So there was a hero, Ahmet Khan, twice a hero of the Soviet Union, fighter pilot from the Crimean Tatars. He was like the only Crimean Tatar that was like exempted from deportation, but they did deport his family, so like it didn't really matter. He ended up having to go east into Uzbekistan anyway. There was even a German Komsomol hero that had died after being captured by the Nazis at the Battle of Brest. So he was. You had like real short turnover. Like they were praising this German communist, Komsomol member who had been martyred for the Soviet cause against the Nazis, and then not too much longer, they accused the entire German population of hiding saboteurs, waiting for orders from Berlin to start blowing things up. Although there was no evidence, and then they rounded up first in the Crimea and then in the Volga. The German population, they are all shipped into Siberia and Kazakhstan. So if you look at that, you can see even the Koreans had been deported in 1937, but there were still some Koreans in the army because they were west of the deportation line. And there's some of those that are kind of held up as great heroes, although the rest of their people are languishing in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and the men that were actually deported were banned from service in the military, so they were drafted for forced labor, so-called Trudovaya Armia, which was mostly ethnic Germans, but it did have a few other condemned nationalities in it.
Okay, so basically, the war kicks it into overdrive, but the roots for this sort of thing were sown before, essentially.
I would say 1936 was the new Soviet Constitution, the first show trials, the articles in Pravda, and this is also, you have at this time the removal from the head of the NKVD of Genrikh Yagoda, who was Jewish and had a kind of a Jewish network around him. He's replaced with Yezhov. Yagoda's network isn't finally kind of totally removed until the end of 1938, but already in 1936, you see Yagoda himself is removed from power as the head of the NKVD and replaced by Yezhov. Yezhov, ethnic Russian from Vilnius in Lithuania.
Okay. Now, sort of my next question here is all this talk about kind of ethnos, sort of the importance that the Soviet Union placed from the Stalinist era onward, as I understand it, of sort of nationality, sort of having these kind of autonomous sort of ethno-states sort of within the umbrella of the Soviet Union. These notions of sort of nationality within communism. So you have communism in one country, but even then it's kind of sort of fractious in terms of its power structure, right? So as I understand it correctly, right up until the end of the Soviet Union, a lot of these republics and ethnic minority regions had a lot of say in sort of how they're governed. Is that correct? So in terms of like
it depends what you're talking about, but
right.
They certainly had ability to promote and support their own ethnic group within. That's why they started calling them mafias, ethnic mafias, kind of fiefdoms. So Kazakhstan is a good example. Gorbachev tried to get rid of Kuneyev, who had been in power for a very long time. He'd been even in the Politburo, but he had been around since Khrushchev, and he was removed and replaced with Kolbein, who was not ethnically Kazakh but ethnically Russian. And there was huge riots and demonstrations. And he was first to put Nazarbayev head of the Communist Party in Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev being ethnically Kazakh. So there was this kind of view that the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic was the property of the Kazakh nation, right? That you couldn't put a non-Kazakh ahead of it. That these affirmative action programs like preference for ethnic Kazakhs to go to university in Kazakhstan, right? These were the rights that showed that this was the Kazakh collective property.
Okay, so the idea was essentially you have this sort of top-down system with, of course, the idea of socialist economics, right?
Yeah,
but
Stalin called it national in form and socialist in content, and the joke was it became socialist in form and nationalist in content.
Okay. so you'd have in sort of going forward with this sort of state ownership of the means of production, so on and so forth, this sort of more egalitarian, stable sort of system that they envisioned, they were perfectly cool with, as a means of achieving that, empowering local authorities with their own sort of, we could call it ethnic characteristics, their own region. They can put their own regional flair on it, so long as they go along with the bigger program. We don't care who's in charge. It could be locals. If that works, great. If they want to do it in their language, that's great. If they want to have their own cultures and customs within, so long as they conform to the larger, bigger picture.
Basically, there's a lot of promotion of symbolic ethnicity, a culture of this idea of and particular ways of life, as long as they don't oppose kind of socialist brotherhood, the union government in Moscow. So there's no real political or economic autonomy, but obviously there's a lot being going on, things like language and literature and folk dances. So basically, you get the socialism written in 110 languages.
Right. It's socialism, but with your accoutrements sort of sprinkled on top. Yeah. Okay, cool. So that also seems to be sort of again very much at odds with the sort of what you would call sort of communists today, so, right? So Antifa types are very much very what hostile to the very idea of sort of nationalities to a certain extent, in a way that's kind of authentic, right? So the notion, the Western idea that it's sort of all a social construct which is designed to sort of keep the workers from coming together. That's basically the only thing that's in vogue now. But the Soviets had a much more, I think, realistic, pragmatic notion that
right, because they had to rule over. I mean, in the Soviet Union, it wasn't as bad as Tsarist Russia because the big chunks in the West, particularly Poland, became independent states. But most of the Soviet time, ethnic Russians were between 50 and 60% of the population of the Soviet Union as a whole. So it meant all these other national groups together were something like 40 to 45%. So almost half if you put them collectively together. So there's and territorialized quite large Central Asia, Ukraine in particular. So, and lots of resources. So they had to find a way to manage them. So they kind of, as I said, took Lord Lugard and turned him up to 11 because Lugard was actually quite successful in West Africa.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense, and that's again sort of to tie it back. So sort of Bioleninism use, in addition to sort of whatever money is coming from foreign powers who are interested in overthrowing the regime, sort of use minorities, use sort of get the disaffected people, the deviants, and so on and so forth. Have them help become part of your coalition. They'll sort of owe their position to you. And sort of once you're in charge of the regime, and now you have the business of sort of managing everything and getting all these different peoples who don't necessarily want to, do things the same way, then we sort of have the crackdown. Then the Biostalinism comes in, replaces that, and then you have sort of a more pragmatic way of dealing with all these different people, right?
Right, but you don't need to get rid of all of the concept of nationalnost or ethnos. You just need to get rid of those that you can't kind of force into the Soviet framework. So, right, so you can get rid of the Germans because there's only 1.5 million of them. You can get rid of the Chechens. There are only 400,000 of them. You can kind of exile them as serfs and put them under kind of an apartheid system throughout Kazakhstan and Siberia. So you can kind of tailor the system here, as it were, to your needs. So only those groups that don't adapt. So like the other groups, including fairly large ones, Uzbeks, Georgians, after the famine, Ukrainians, they're able to kind of adjust them enough that they're no longer deemed to be potential threats.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just, I just saw this comment here. It says from 73 elephants, communism is just chimp politics, verbally rationalized. Kill the current alpha chimp utopia until the new alpha chimp starts beating up all the other chimps, just like the old one did. Yeah, I think that's essentially it. And then we also have here from Arbathrax Vologosk. No, it's more like fever dream version of monkey politics. So it's monkey politics on steroids, apparently.
I don't know anything about monkeys.
Me neither. Other than that, apparently chimps will beat the tar out of each other.
I don't know. My daughter, when she came to Ghana, wanted to see monkeys. So I asked everybody I knew and said, well, we don't have any zoos anymore because the government bankrupt. So if you go way, way up north into the nature reserves, you could see monkeys. I said, like, how far is that? Well, past Kumasi. And I'm thinking, that's a bit far.
I go way out of there to see monkeys. All right.
Yeah, go out to the jungle. You can see monkeys, but
now, sort of kind of coming to a close here, one of the things I wanted to sort of address here is that, as I was mentioning earlier, this idea that the Soviets had not a racial view, it would be considered different. This idea of ethnos, it isn't really much talked about these days. I don't think it's really denied that much. But what's kind of the historiography on sort of this topic? What are some sort of what's sort of the relevant literature on sort of this material?
Well, it depends what you're talking about. I mean, as I said, it kind of splits up. But if you want to just talk about kind of the theory of ethnos, right? It's not really in history so much as in anthropology. And probably the guy who's doing the most interesting work is in Aberdeen, Scotland now, a guy named David Anderson. And there's some people around him talking about kind of the influence, the genealogy of Shirokagorov, how his work influenced Bromley and people before Bromley that were not allowed to openly publish. But we know, for instance, Soviet scholars, for instance, that went to China and brought back Shirakogorov's work, and that they were in the libraries and there were discussions about it. But the first legal publication wasn't until '69, but also influence in Japan, influence in China, where I don't think it was ever kind of blacklisted the way he was in the Soviet Union. So I think he could be mentioned in the People's Republic of China. But I don't know. I can't read Chinese. But and also, as I mentioned, his influence in Germany, Muhlmann, influence in South Africa. So he had a kind of a big kind of approach. So there was an article in 2019, Current Anthropology, as I said, by David Anderson. It's probably, if you look there, it's got a discussion by a bunch of people in there and their works you can look at. We're talking about the idea of racial discrimination in the Soviet Union. There's very little written on it. Really, like the only, let's see if I can get it. It's in my bookshelf. There's like really only a couple of books deal with it. My good friend John Chang's book on the Koreans. They were deported in '37, called "Burnt by the Sun." That came out in 2017. There's a book that came out by Medina Tlastanova. I think she's part Balkar. She talks about the Balkars, but she talks about it in a racial framework. She's in Sweden. But for the most part, no. I mean, there's a couple of the kind of leading scholars of nationality studies, so Francine Hirsch and Amir Viner, have defended the Soviet Union from the charges of racial discrimination in very militant and extremist way. And that goes back about 20 years when Eric Weitz, who was a scholar of Germany and the Holocaust, wrote an article for Slavic Review suggesting that the way Nationalnost was used in the deportations and special settlement regime during the Second World War was in fact racist in everything but name. And their entire defense was, no, Nationalnost isn't race, therefore it can't be racial discrimination.
It's funny. I was listening to Michael Malice. He was talking about North Korea. And one of the things that he said was that the North Koreans said was basically exactly what you just said. So they said, concentration camps, no. We don't call them that, so we don't have them. Essentially. It's like, we don't call them that, so we don't have them. So yeah. This is Western propaganda. All right. I got a question here from Steve. It says, safe to say that the Soviets saw the recalcitrant Nationalnost as impediments to communism, while Nazis saw other races as biological enemies of the German people. Question. So, what is your?
I think so. I think that is certain Nationalnosti were viewed as peoples that could not be fit into the socialist state. They could not be made into new socialist man, so they had to be neutralized and isolated forever. And in the process, a lot of them dying prematurely was just a bonus.
Less Chechens to deal with. Yeah.
Right. But I think part of the problem, and you see this with the people like Francine Hirsch, is that their only model for any type of a system that distinguishes and people and distributes rights and privileges on the basis of ancestry or kinship or lineage or however you want to talk about it, but what your parents were. They see Nazi Germany as the only model. So you can't even if you try and point them out, that there's a whole bunch of different ways in which rights and privileges can be restricted for groups on the basis of ancestry that are very different than Nazi Germany. They're kind of like, well, at a loss. So what I mean, as pointed out, the ethnos theory, it still adhered to in China. It's still adhered to in Japan. It's still adhered to in Korea. Those are all countries where there has been legally, I guess Japan has finally removed it, but until recently they had very strict laws discriminating against people of Korean ancestry.
Yeah, and I guess sort of one of the things that would distinguish, one of the reasons why I guess that the Soviets might not have gone as gung-ho about, you could say, eliminating some of these more problematic groups from their perspective, like the Chechens, Germans, and so forth, was because it's a lot easier, particularly when you have such a vast territory like the USSR. It's a lot easier to sort of just ship them out to the countryside and have them work for you than to, try to kill them all. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, almost always it's easier to forcibly evict, expel, or deport a group than it is to kill it. And of course, there's the labor issue that you can use them for forced labor, which was done, particularly in the case of the ethnic Germans. Where you do see kind of like the mass killings, directly, there's a geographical problem. You can't move the people out anywhere. There's no space. So Rwanda, very tiny, right? There you ended up with people being chopped up into pieces with machetes, but it's largely because the Hutu had no place to expel the Tutsi too.
Right. Yeah, because that's the thing in the USSR. I mean, so much of it is unpeopled, so that if you got 400,000 people who are giving you problems, you just ship them off to where they're not a problem to you or anybody else, and just put up guards so they can't leave.
Well, they still were a problem, even dispersed across Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. But
less of a problem, I guess.
Yeah, less of a problem for the Soviets. But yes.
Now, here's a question. Sort of once they were dispersed, some of these, let's just say Chechens. So once Chechens were sort of dispersed across Kazakhstan, how well did they get on with the locals? Is there anything about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of tension. I don't know so much about the Chechens. I do know quite a bit about the Germans. There were some cases, Kazakhs helping the Germans, giving them food and whatnot. And there's also some of that with the other groups like the Chechens. But there's also a lot of tension because oftentimes, Kazakhs would be minding their own business, and now they've got to house these strange people that don't speak a language that they speak. They're taking up rooms in their house. And the people that are deported don't want to work. They feel like they've just been robbed of everything, and they're really pissed. There's a lot of social tension. There were a lot of cases of Kazakhs didn't want the Germans who were not Muslim to be buried in local cemeteries, right? So they would refuse, and lots of Germans were, of course, dying in 41 and 42 from lack of food and medical care and the harsh winter and lack of proper clothing, etc. So there's all these tensions. It's one of the reasons why they mobilized a huge number of them for forced labor and sent them to the Urals to work in labor camps, was to remove the able-bodied Germans that were capable of presenting a problem in these social tensions. So then only people left in the Kazakh Ols from the Germans were the women, children, and old men. And then in October of 42, all the able-bodied women were also sent out. So there was just the people that were weak and sick or very young or very old.
Okay. So basically, tensions that perfectly foreseen headbuttings, as you might guess, but nothing too extreme.
There are some extremes. I mean, there's physical fights would break out.
Okay.
A couple cases of cohorts managers killing Chechens or other North Caucasians, Karachais. One where they burned them to death.
The one place that I do know where when you had a lot of people sort of from the outside come in and there would be mass sort of violent reaction to them was I believe it was in Latvia. Is that correct? So when a lot of Russians would sort of come into,
not so much Latvia. Latvia, the Russians were successfully able to actually almost become a majority of the population. So they brought the Latvian population down to about 53%. But in Lithuania, yes, the Lithuanian guerrillas were able to basically they would burn down the farms that had been taken over by Russian settlers from Lithuanians deported into Siberia, and with the Russian settlers in them often, and this would be like a warning. So the Russians didn't want to come. So when the Baltic states got their independence back, Lithuania was only 10% Russian, and then another 10% was Polish from Vilnius from the pre-war period. So they were still 80% ethnically Lithuanian. Latvia was like 53% Latvian, and Estonia was like 65% Estonian. But they had been, like 90% before the Soviet takeover.
Okay. So the repression of the Balkans, that
Baltics.
was, I'm sorry, yeah, not the Balkans, very different area.
Other end of the continent.
Yeah, other end of the continents, yes. The repression of the Baltics, yes. That was because as I understand, the Baltic states were sort of absorbed at a later point compared to some of the others. Is that correct?
The Baltic states got independence in 1918. And then in 1940, the Soviets took them over briefly, and there's a mass deportation on 14th of June, 1941. But 22nd of June, 1941, the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. They quickly move up the coast with the First Army Group there in the north towards Leningrad. So they're then under German rule until 45 or 44, 45. The Soviets come back in, and you have guerrilla resistance in all three Baltic states, but particularly Lithuania, from all the way up until the early 50s, about 52. But there's the two mass deportations. One that's just Lithuania in 48, Operation Vesna or Spring, and then there's one all three Baltic republics in March of 1949, Operation Preboy or Surf, like a surf on an ocean. And Operation Preboy essentially does for the Baltic states what the deportation of kulaks did for the Soviet Union itself, and that is it terrorizes the middle peasants to join the collective farms. So they're successfully able to collectivize agriculture, but this also deprives the guerrillas of their shelter and food and support. So, just like the Boers that fought against the British depended upon swimming in the sea of the people, as Mao would say, right? If you dry up all the supplies for the guerrillas, then the insurgency dies.
Right. So it seems like in the Baltics, compared to maybe some of the other places, there was much more conscious effort to sort of colonize the place with ethnic Russians. Is that correct?
No, I mean, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, Russians outnumbered the indigenous population in the 60s and 70s. There was Kyrgyz were a minority at one time in Kyrgyzstan. They are when Kazakhstan first got its independence back, they had to kind of fudge the first census because the ethnic Kazakhs were only a plurality and not a majority of the population.
Okay. All right, cool. So there was quite a bit of colonization going on. See, this is why I'm glad I have you here.
Yeah, well, look up something called.
It always seems like Eurasian history, Eurasian studies is one of the more neglected parts of.
Well, it doesn't exist anymore. There's a good article by Kenzador. He's an anthropologist of Uzbekistan. But basically, all the funding for study, particularly of Central Asia, was cut. There's no more money for any research on it, unless you're like directly employed by Soros or the CIA or the State Department. So, if you're going to work for a university as an independent scholar, forget it. They don't want to hear what you have to say.
No,
they want you to toe the party line.
Nobody wants to know about Tajikistan, Otto. Nobody.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So here's a question: is there any Western USA equivalents to nationalnost in modern day?
I guess we don't have nationalnost in the sense the Soviet did. We have ethnicity, but it's not constructed as a legal category that is assigned on the basis of your parentage and your ancestry. And certainly, we don't have a category of descent from particular cultural groups that determines rights and privileges the way it did in the Soviet Union. So instead, we have these big racial groups. But as I discussed on kind of ethnogenesis of America, right, the term "white" is it basically just means almost that we're not those people that are not white. It doesn't mean there's there's no content to it. It's just the barrier.
Right. Yeah. No, here, let me see, Mr. Patriarch. Question from Mr. Pohl. Here we go. So, if Russia is a case of communist ethnopolitics, where there is a central group providing the state's base, what about Yugoslavia?
Well, Yugoslavia, in many ways, based upon the Soviet model, particularly the republics being based. But obviously, during most of the state's existence in its second coming, there was a non-communist Yugoslav state between World War I and World War II. But the communist Yugoslav state, the center was just one guy, Josip Broz Tito, who was half Croatian and half Slovene. So it was always like the early Soviet Union wanting to put brakes on the Serbians as kind of the main threat to the idea of national equality. That if there was going to be national chauvinism coming from the center, it was going to be Serbian-based, like it was in the first Yugoslavia. So I would say the reason Yugoslavia doesn't become a Serbian core-based state the way the Soviet Union is a Russian-based state is because Tito lived so much longer than Stalin. And by the time Tito dies, because they haven't developed any kind of centralized, long-lasting center, it's not that much longer before the republics break apart. I mean, they start getting looser and looser until they become not just autonomous, but totally independent. And then there's the Yugoslav Civil War. But certainly, we see kind of Biostalinism in Yugoslavia early on with in 1944 to 1946 was the communist rooting out and eliminating their German and Hungarian minorities.
Okay. So there we go. Long live the Tsar. Okay. Nice. So I guess sort of we have the big question here. Talking about all this deportations and sort of colonizations and nationalist chauvinism, I guess the big question is, where are all the Polistanis? So where are your people?
I don't know. I tried to get them to come. Well, I don't see very many of them. Maybe they're all lurking.
That's okay. Good. All right, cool. So this has been just about an hour and a half. This has been great. Here, let me just look here. I'm just going through my notes here. As I'm looking for these, I would encourage anyone who's sort of new, of course, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel, Mr. Patriarch. I am very close to 1,000 subs, and hopefully, we'll break that soon. Also, of course, go subscribe to Otto's channel. I've provided link in the show note description. He's you're close to 800 subs. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm about 769, I think now.
Oh, awesome, cool. Yeah, so definitely go give him a bump. He's got a lot of. So if you like this sort of material, really sort of in-depth historical analysis, he's easily one of the best channels I've seen for that. Sometimes it'll be things that I didn't even like, wait, we're talking about what today? Okay, cool. But it's really, really in-depth stuff. So I would encourage all you.
I talked about Africa. Did you not know about that continent?
Yeah. Yeah. But specifically, the one that I thought was interesting was your discussion of the ethnic Germans in the Russian Empire. So I had known, of course, that there had been quite a few ethnic Germans sprinkled throughout Eastern and Central Europe, but I just didn't know how much, and I never knew sort of what happened to them after sort of the events.
Are you talking about the conversations I did with Lena Wolf?
I believe the ones that I had seen. I haven't seen those ones yet. The ones I had looked at.
Lena Wolf is an ethnic German from Kazakhstan, but I have 2 conversations with her.
Okay, cool. Excellent. Yeah, no, I'll definitely go check those out. I've just been the one thing they're a little bit longer format videos. So for the first about 45 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes will be a lot of lecture, and then there's lots of chats and stuff afterwards. So those can be really funny depending on who he has as a guest, who phones in. But yeah, being a new dad, my watch time, I got a whole list of videos that I've downloaded, which I'm just trying to find time to watch. And the Lena Wolf ones are among those. So you said she was an ethnic German in Kazakhstan.
Well, from Kazakhstan. She now lives in London.
Okay. And I guess
she grew up in Kazakhstan.
Okay. So I guess this is sort of one of my last questions is, after all this sort of once the whole system sort of broke down, what happened to sort of all these different groups with these ethnic relations? What happened to the Russians in Latvia? What happened to the Germans in Kazakhstan? And
a lot of them have emigrated to their home country or ancestral homeland.
Okay. So obviously, like a German born in Kazakhstan would never have seen Germany, but they're more likely to go there
Well, most of them
because
did go to Germany. There were 1 million Germans by Nationalnost in Kazakhstan in 1989, and about 200,000 are left, and the vast majority of the rest have migrated to Germany.
okay. So basically, after the Soviet Union's all said and done, a lot of these minority populations would eventually find their way back to their land of ancestral origin. Is that
Many of
correct?
them. It depends on which groups, because if the country has a right of return, then usually most of them would make it out. So you had not all, but a lot of ethnic Russians left the Baltic states and Central Asia to go to the Russian Federation. You had something like 90% of ethnic Germans in Kyrgyzstan, 100% in Tajikistan, 80% in Kazakhstan have migrated to Germany. It's less so the Germans in Siberia, but even there they've gone from 900,000 to less than 400,000. You also have had the Greeks. Many of them have gone to Greece. They have a right of return. Ethnic Poles to Poland, and of course, a large number of Jews, who has always been an ethno-national racial category in Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire, including the Soviet Union, have gone to Israel or the United States. So the diaspora nationalities, they have external homelands or the groups that have other republics that got independent. Many of them have left. So the German population, as I said, almost all of them left Tajikistan. 90% left Kyrgyzstan. 80% left Kazakhstan. There's still some in Uzbekistan, but it's not a lot, like 40,000 or so.
Yeah.
Crimean Tatars, about half of them left Uzbekistan to go back to Crimea. A lot of the Meskhetian Turks left, but they couldn't get back to Georgia. They ended up going other places, including the United States. You see Koreans moving to various places, including some to South Korea, but mostly to the Russian Federation. There has been a considerable migration since the Soviet Union collapsed to make these republics much more homogenous. So, as I say, the Kazakhs were only a plurality, and now, of course, they're a definite majority, primarily due to out migration of ethnic Russians, but also second place these 800,000 Germans who went to what was West Germany at first, and then just Germany.
Okay. So I guess sort of my my last question before we close here is sort of this this bio-Stalinist idea. How, to what extent do you see this sort of being played out in modern times, or in the Western context, warped to sort of different to something other than than it was?
Yeah, you know, the thing is, the Bioleninist idea seems to have taken off in the U.S. It's inspired by people like Herbert Marcuse, but it's not stable and it's not popular. And you almost think, in order for there not to be total collapse, that there has to be something like what Stalin did in the Soviet Union. That is, all right, we can't have like every single tiny tribe, go their own way. Like the Chechens are gonna have socialism with Sufi brotherhoods and the elders controlling the kolkhozes for the clan rather than or the Tiep rather than for the party. That just won't work, right? So eventually, they have to kind of trim the edges, as it were. So you see this I think probably the most notable is with the sexual deviance in the Soviet Union is they go from having sailors have gay marriages in Leningrad to you go to prison for 5 years where they could meet other men. But
Right.
it I'm not sure how it works in the U.S. because the way it looks like in the U.S. is like the one group that they all seem like centered on hating is the core Anglo group, right? The white population.
Yeah.
But that was in the Soviet context, that would have been the Russians. So the idea of kind of uh, a white people's Soviet Socialist Republic seizing power and then going after the formerly empowered minorities. While we did see something kind of like that in the Soviet Union under Stalin, it's difficult to imagine it in the U.S.
Yeah, no, certainly. The ideology is not there. The socialism isn't there. The racial animus isn't there. And if we look at elite theory, I mean, there's nobody with any sort of authority or billions of dollars who wants to see anything like that happen. So I don't expect it will. Yeah, as far as sort of in my situation here in South Africa, it's racial politics are a big thing, but again, it's a little different from the Soviet idea of ethnos. So you do have a little bit of that residual, more small scale local flavor. So the Zulus, for example, they still have a king who has some rights and privileges, who has some lands through the Ngunyama Trust, who isn't necessarily keen on some of the ideas of expropriation without compensation and ideas like that.
Did they get rid of all of the structures of the Bantustans?
Yes and no. So there's been partially, I think, to sort of encourage the
because that was kind of the South African answer to the Soviet Socialist republics. Get your own little state.
Yeah. So what ended up happening now is so of course you have freedom of movement now in South Africa. So you have a lot of people flooding into the cities, Johannesburg and Cape Town, especially. But what's happened is in the rural areas, a lot of the privileges and even new ones are sort of being extended to traditional tribal leaders as a way of sort of greasing the palms of people who can get votes for the ANC out in the sticks, essentially.
That's exactly what happened in Ghana. The first independent government under Nkrumah tried to suppress the power of the chiefs and the kings and the other traditional leaders, but because of their particularly control over land, they were able to basically create a parallel political structure that then the elected Republican government had to kowtow to. So now you have a republic with 100 kings and chiefs that are all powerful.
Yeah. So in South Africa, you sort of that's sort of the thing. So, and the national level, it's all racial politics. It's all race. It's all race all the time. Ideas of sort of ethnos and sort of local characteristic flavor doesn't really play into it. It's black.
That was what Iceland feared. When Iceland set up the Bantu education system in the 1950s, his fear was that if there was a kind of just the free capitalist development, that the Xhosas and Zulus and Tswanas would all kind of become just an urban black mass with no cultural distinctions among them.
Yeah, and that's what's happened. I've talked with some of my friends here who are Sutu or Xhosa or Zulu. And that's the big thing that they say is the biggest danger to local African culture. So out in the countryside, they still sort of keep to sort of older traditions, customs, live family structures and stuff. And they're, very civilized, very nice people. They have a very sophisticated sort of localized etiquette and stuff. But as soon as the big problems come, like you say, when you have this mass urbanization and they just sort of become black and deracinated, and that's when a lot of the problems start, unfortunately. And that's that's sort of one of the things which isn't talked about at all in South African politics today, but it's a very real issue, and has a lot of impact on family life, upon family structure, sexual relations. And yeah, it's a huge problem.
But there certainly must be traditionalists that are worried about it. I mean,
yeah,
if you're like a Zulu nationalist, right, you don't want to trade that in to just be black.
Yeah, no, that's and that's the thing. And I think that's one of the things about probably why it doesn't get a lot of play in South Africa, is because the ANC to a certain extent does want everybody to just be black, right? Because if you're black,
that's true, because they viewed the kind of ethnic differentiation that people like Iceland thought was good, because it would keep Xhosas and Zulus preserved as peoples, as a way to divide black opposition to the white apartheid government.
Yeah. So that's the thing. So here in South Africa, I mean, Biostalinism, kind of, sort of, not really, I guess. So they're trying to, instead of having nationalities, they're trying to racialize the country, scrub away the ethnicities, and basically impose.
So you just have four groups of people.
Yeah, so you got whites, blacks, coloreds, and Indians, essentially. So
all of the cultural distinctions then for the other groups will be kind of merged away.
Yeah, essentially. So like BEE applies to black. It doesn't apply to Xhosas or Zulus, or it's so within these tribal areas, again, they have a lot of sway, a lot of influence, but particularly in the urban areas, it's all that goes away. So anyways, I guess I'm going to wrap up now. I'm looking at the time.
Right, well, thank you very much for having me on, Mr. Patriarch.
Absolutely, Otto. And again, I will remind everybody, please go subscribe to Otto's channel. You can find links to his Twitter and his YouTube within the channel. Also, if you go there, you will find a link to Patreon if you want to support his work after seeing lots of his material and learning many things. Also, please subscribe to this channel if you have not yet. And yeah, good night, everybody. Patriarch.
All right, thanks a lot. It's afternoon here, but all right.
Enjoy. Patriarch out. Bye, guys.
All right.